Hello and welcome to our final Zoom feedback chat for Working Lives in the Reaway. I hope you've made it this far and thanks very much if you have. So what we'll do here is answer a couple of questions that came up in this week on the Clarks, and then address a couple of broader issues that we've seen mentioned in the final feedback or as we've gone through the 4 weeks. So one of the comments that always comes up in the Clarks week is how we define Clark and all the many different roles that includes. This was partly because we're using a Victorian definition of this term rather than a modern definition, and also because of lack of time in the course. We've basically lumped together a lot of professions under this one category. Do you want to say more about that, Ollie?
Yeah, I mean, I think people rightly were pointing out in the comments that some of the sort of senior engineers and things would have bridled at being described as a mere clerk, but we're using it here as the sort of outside perspective to a lot of ordinary Victorians whose only contact with the railways was as a passenger. These people would have all been clerks, and clerks was also the sort of more usual term. Office workers is one that we'd use as a sort of catch-all maybe now, that would encompass people who were quite senior managers who happened to work in an office, but that wasn't a term that the Victorians particularly used.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's unfortunate shorthand more than anything else.
It is. I guess we mean if you sometimes sat at a desk or a drawing board. Yeah, if you wrote, if you drew as part of your work, then for the purposes of this course, we're going to define you as a clerk. But yeah, some people might be turning in their graves at that category, but it's a useful broad brush term in this context.
Also that we wanted to capture people like Sam Fay, who started out quite low and then went up went up to the top. And I think people were finding that story quite interesting. So it let us capture the whole of his professional career.
Yeah. This week, everybody really enjoyed the exam. We're having a lot of fun discussing their answers. There were a couple of specific questions that I don't know if we do know the answer to. One was about the score that you needed to pass, which I don't think we know, do we?
No, I don't think that part of the document survives. We literally have the exam paper. I mean, we know that Marjorie did pass and went on to work for the Great Western Railway, but we don't know whether she was sort of scraping through at the bottom or really sailing through with a great marks, I'm afraid.
Know what her score was?
I think it was an amalgam is the problem. I think she scored, of the questions that we had, I think she scored 15.
Oh, well, it looks like a lot of people in this course would have got the Clark's
Would have done all right, yes, on that bit.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Do we know if you had the same exam, regardless of any type of position as a clerk?
I think it's very difficult, because the more senior you are, the more likely it was that you'd probably risen to that position through the ranks. So there wouldn't have been a need for sort of probably internal examination in the same way. Your track record would be assumed to speak for itself. So that this is the problem. We're looking at entry level exams, I think, here.
Yeah. We had a question about Reaway magazines and would it have been possible to link to more of them. That's a little bit tricky just because of accessibility of those magazines, I think.
We've quoted from a couple, and as people have seen, we've lifted text. We've sometimes lifted images where we've been able to. And I know that people in the comments have been saying, well, various of the really great railway societies have been digitizing these magazines, but a lot of them are behind a paywall just to cover the costs of the digitization for these societies involved. And I think one of the sort of rules around Future Learn is that we've got, as Kirsty says, of course, it's got to be accessible, and we can't be linking to things that are behind paywalls, because that's just not fair on everyone. And these sites aren't always accessible wherever you might be taking this course from around the world as well.
Yeah, but if you do have access to Reaway magazines, then certainly that is a really fun thing to follow up.
Yeah, and if you are, our library is finally opening up now that sort of the threat of COVID is hopefully receding. So if you do want to come up to York, we have the whole runs of these magazines, and they're freely accessible in our search engine library and archives, and the staff there will be more than happy to help you look through them.
Yes. Yeah, a great way to spend your post-lockdown time. If only we could all be in the archives every day. Let's see. And I think people enjoyed learning about the various hobbies that were mentioned in relation to Sam Fay and other railway workers. We did have a question about the extracurricular activities of the workers more, and especially did some of them take up art? That was an interesting question.
Yeah, I think people drawing here on things like the pitmen painters and things. I can't. I mean, railway workers were painters. I think we've got a good selection of that in the museum's collection, and obviously there would have been more. We've just got a chance survival of them. There are groups like the Guild of Railway Artists that was set up in the 1970s. Although you don't have to have been a railway worker to be part of that. You just have to be an artist who's interested in depicting railways. One of the interesting things about the extracurricular activities is during the week on Crosley, people were amusing his sort of comedy interview that they have in Enginorum about the huge range of the choir and the football and the athletics club and the all the different things and the drinking. And these are sort of people come to what an amazing array of social activities he was involved in. A lot of these were sponsored by the company, not the drinking. But the athletics club, the football club, the swimming club, all of these were, by the end of the 19th century, things run by the Great Western Railway themselves for their staff. So subsidised. You could sing in a choir, you could do a St John's ambulance course, all sponsored by the Great Western Railway at the time. And that was by no means unique for the big companies across Britain for the railway. So a lot of the sort of socialising and associational culture happened around company-sponsored activities.
Yeah, and the company-sponsored magazines.
Yes.
And to reflect that, don't they?
But everyone's having a great jolly time in the company magazines doing company activities. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so those were really the main things we picked out from the week in the Clerks. We'll check back, so if you've got burning questions, do keep posting them. Over the 4 weeks, we've had a few broader questions. One of them that always comes up is around issues of railway pay. As I think we said in the comments or in one of these recordings, this is a really complicated issue because it changes so much over the period because of things like fines and bonuses that affect what we now call your kind of weekly take-home pay because of variations within the companies and so forth. There is a really interesting article that I'll tell you about just as an example. Again, unfortunately, we can't link to it because it's on JSTOR, so I only have access via my academic institution. But it's by Dr. Peter Howlett, and he looked at the wage books of the Great Eastern Railway and at the traffic staff, which includes everybody from the boys assisting the porters up to signalmen. So that is a category we looked at. It's a very detailed historical article, but a couple of interesting things about it. He looked at 848 employees, and amongst those, there were 268 different job titles. So that just highlights the, how varied railway labour was, and also the difficulty of tracing things like what all these different 260 kinds of people got paid. But when you look within traffic staff, in the 1870s, roughly speaking, your pay went from 12 to 20 shillings a week. By 1900, roughly speaking, 17 to 30 shillings. So if you imagine our signalman in 1870, he's taking home 20 shillings. That's £1 a week. So roughly about £50 a year. Now, to put that in context, round about the 1870s, I mean, this is all very broad brush, but if you wanted to lead a reasonably well-off middle-class lifestyle in which you had a nice house, a nursemaid, servants, your wife didn't work, you had a horse and carriage, you could socialise and go on holiday, you needed £200 a year. So your signalman is not earning anywhere near that. However, £1 a week is generally considered a good wage for a working person. Sorry, I can't join the broadcast. Yeah, so decent working wages, but nowhere near a middle-class lifestyle, or at least some of our categories. And that's the higher end. At the lower end, Howlett reckons that even the lowest grade of railway worker was probably earning a bit more than an agricultural labourer. And if you moved a little way up the ranks, you would also be earning more than, say, dockyard workers. So what he describes as level 2 jobs in that article, maybe say an assistant porter, you'd be earning more than your local shipyard workers, but that's still not a lot. I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that, Ollie.
Absolutely. I think, people are always interested because they're sort of aware that engine drivers are the sort of aristocracy, and there's this phrase, the sort of the aristocracy of the working class. I mean, we're still not talking anything approaching what Kirsty's talking about for middle class lifestyle. We might be talking about closer to £2, maybe even £3 a week, which would have made an enormous difference for people, at that level, but still nowhere near the sort of the comfortable middle class standard of living.
Yeah, and if you think about clerks, they're not regarded as well off. But if you look at, say, the Diary of a Nobody, which, if you want to read a famous humorous Victorian novel about the lives of the clerks, is brilliant. He's not a railway clerk, Peter, but yeah.
No,
but
he's a shipping clerk, I think, isn't he?
Clerk, yeah, so not unrelated, but he lives in, one of the new red brick Victorian suburban villas, doesn't he? And he's got a servant.
He has that sort of classic maid of all works who's very, very put upon, and his wife doesn't work, and he has a sort of feckless son who he supports financially.
Yeah, so he's not rich.
No, but much more comfortable than our signalman would have been. And that's the other thing to sort of bear in mind is I think we always try and, because it's so complicated, we always think about wages in the past as static. But the second half of the 19th century is huge fluctuations in the cost of living as industry changes, as new mass manufactured goods start to come into the market, but also as machines start to replace workers in key industries and skills are de-skilled. Yeah. So, this was an enormous period of fluctuation. There were times, and this drove people towards the unions, and why, when we discussed in the first week, why the unions were just so big by the end of the 19th century, is that they offered a sort of bulwark against this very shifting pattern of wages against the cost of living. So.
We had an interesting question. I think it's a general question about Freemasonry in the railways. Now, we don't have much specific information about this, though I would imagine it was a factor. But one thing we just wanted to comment on was how important all of those, primarily all-male associations, were throughout the long Victorian period. The Freemasons have sort of emerged victorious as the ones that still exist and that we know most about. But there are hugely important organizations that you might not have heard of, like the Oddfellows. Yep. And what are they? The Ancient Order of
Foresters, I think, aren't they? Yes. But also we were talking about, like the temperance movement, which nowadays is a historical oddity, I think. But I think you've got to remember that I think the most recent historical research that's been done on this suggests that 1 in 3 adults was involved in the temperance movement at some point in their lives, and a lot of people come into it and then go out of it, or sort of join as sort of bright-eyed young adults or things like this, and then become very weary of it. But these are enormous social associational movements, and as Kirsty says, they were not often but not exclusively male as well, and prove just another opportunity for a sort of advancement and association and getting to know one another. And when we were talking about Sam Fay, we talked about how canny a lot of his moves were in terms of sort of taking on the company magazine, sort of romancing his boss's daughter. These were all slightly with an eye towards his next step in the career ladder.
Yes.
So joining this sort of associational culture would have been another step towards that.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people were very, very networked.
Yes.
Outside the company, so your promotion might be because of Freemasonry, might be because your boss was a Freemason. Your boss might be an office holder in the Good Templars Temperance Association with you. Your boss and you might attend the same church and belong to the same debating society. All these things could be happening simultaneously.
And they cut back to this. I mean, we always sort of see this as nepotistic and clearly it was, but it also cuts back to the interesting discussion that was going on in the comments about character and how that's different to a modern CV. Yeah. And the Victorians, took your work experience and your perceived sort of moral standing and activities and associations into account. So this, you know, whilst it clearly was a closed shop and a way to promote certain people above other people, it would also have been a good, you know, it would have been seen as a sort of valid thing to be doing with your time, to be, as Kirsty says, the same officer in a temperance union with your direct superior or something like that. It would have helped you be seen to be the right sort of person.
Yes.
Yeah.
And finally, we always have a lot of questions about what people would like to know more about that
Ah,
we've been able
yes.
to cover. So there's a question about track maintenance men, plate layers. I did have a comment on that, which is that actually Alexander Anderson, the surfaceman poet,
Yes.
surfaceman, is a track maintenance man. And his writings, largely poems and songs of the rail, have some entertaining and enlightening accounts
Yeah.
of his work. We also had questions about, an interesting question about setup of trains and the people who worked on the trains, like the conductors and the porters.
Yeah. People always want to know about this because this is a change that people are all aware is happening in the period that we're talking about. So the abolition of second class, so the move towards the sort of third class and first class, which is now mirrored in the sort of, it's always imagined the sort of getting rid of the second class. Actually, second and third merge, which is why you arrive at sort of standard and first class that we have today, although they keep referring to it as third class. That you've got the move away from the closed sort of compartment where you get in and you have to be unlocked at the other end, to the corridor compartment. I always think, if you're struggling to think about this, think about the Hogwarts Express with the sort of, or you know, it's a sleeper car, but Murder on the Orient Express, you know, with the corridor that runs down one side, but then the sort of the compartments running along the other side of the carriage, through to the open carriage that we're all familiar with, or not so familiar with after the last year of no rail travel, particularly today. A lot of these jobs that people are talking about, conductors and on-train crew, as they're now referred to, these start to come in our period. And I think if we'd had 5 or 6 weeks, it would have been lovely to cover that sort of emergence, talk about the dining car staff. We just didn't have time, unfortunately, and we tried to go for 4 of the really big identifiable roles that ordinary Victorians looking in at the railways would have identified as well as important. So
yeah. Oh, and because that question included food on the railways,
oh yeah,
that there is a PhD student at the museum at the minute specifically working on food on trains.
yes, my lovely PhD student, Chloe Shields, who is reasonably active on Twitter and other sort of social media things, sometimes blogs for the museum. So her project is called Eating on the Go, which is a really exciting look at food on the railways and people's anxieties about eating fast food going fast. So if you want a good Victorian tip about how to avoid stomachache, the advice is to put on your shoes before you eat your breakfast, so as not to then bend over on a full stomach, possibly cutting off blood supply to vital organs before you even get on the train. So something to bear in mind when we return to commuting and people are bolting down their breakfast before leaving the door. Shoes on first.
That's a very
Good.
useful tip.
Yes.
I mean, as Ollie was saying, we are sorry that we can only really, you know, cover a few different kinds of people on the course, but that's also because it's not really a 4-week course, it's a 12-week course that covers 3 different industries at a somewhat breakneck pace. So we'll just close by saying that if you haven't followed on with the coal miners and the factory workers, I'd love to see you next week, where I'll be joined by my colleague Arthur McIver to talk about coal mining. And if you do all 3 courses, we'd love to hear what you thought of them in conjunction and the broader issues that emerged from them.
I think so. And the themes that go through are really, really interesting. And I think if you do have further comments or ideas, we'd love to hear those, because I think it's been really heartening to see such interest in working class Victorian history as well. I think it's really exciting for the sort of the academics involved, for the museums as well, to hear from people really enjoying the course and finding out sort of the ways that they can flesh out their knowledge and their family histories. So if you've got comments like that, would love to hear them. And yeah, just thank you for being part of the course.
And what's your reopening date, Ollie?
Uh, next week.
Next week?
Next week. Yes, next week.
Yeah, book tickets now.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, free to open, like free admission. You have to be pre-booked, unfortunately, because we're still within those restrictions, but it is still free. The library and archive will be opening as well. So if you've got that burning desire to get in and see those Reaway magazines, please do come in.
Thanks very much, everybody. We'll see some of you again in the future weeks. And if we won't, then please keep leaving us your feedback. And thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.